Hi folks, this is my video log looking at Treasures of Britain Part 2. This is Karl-James Langford. This is the 24th of April 2015. It's been a lovely sort of day today in Barry in South Wales, out and about with my students, taking them to the coastline at Lansford Major, and also looking at this very issue of treasures in Britain. Now, when you think about it, immediately when you think about treasure, you think about gold, silver treasure, diamond, and so on. Last week in part 1, looking at the treasures, we looked at a wonderful piece of gold work known as the Rilliton Cup. But we also looked at other treasures that basically ain't gold or silver. When we look at the list of treasures on display in the British Museum, for example, a number of the items that we're going to look at today are gold and silver in makeup. And we have one set of chess pieces that we'll be looking at that certainly ain't gold or silver. So let's do the top 10 of treasures in the British Museum. The Hoxley hoard, hoard of silver objects, Eldon Hall hoard, which is a collection again of silver work, Snettisham hoard. This is also of very precious metal for a collection of gold torques and other items found on a number of occasions, which we're looking at today. The Rilliton Cup, the gold cup that we looked at last week. Sutton Hoo treasure that we look at today. The Mould Gold Cape found in North East Wales. And 4 left on the list. The Lewis chess pieces that we'll be looking at today. The Fishpool hoard, a collection of gold coins found at Fishpool. The Cadale hoard, hoard of silver objects from Lancashire, and objects that certainly ain't gold or silver. The Vindolanda tablets found at the Roman fort at Hadrian's Wall. So we'll be looking at some of those objects today. Let's start off with the Desburn Necklace. Seemingly in the centre of England, Staffordshire, Northamptonshire, and so on. We do find a variety of different treasures being found. Throughout the centuries, many of Britain's buried treasures, as we explored last week, have been found by workmen in the course of their employment. One interesting find was where workmen carrying out alterations at Pillerton Hall in Staffordshire in 1742 found gold coins in a hidden cupboard. And a few years later, 25 leather purses found containing gold coins. We turn to Desburn in Northamptonshire. Workmen in 1875, whilst digging for ore, found this wonderful gold necklace with precious stones dating from the 600s. Museum experts have fitted together the 37 pieces, creating a very fine treasure indeed. Next we move on to something that I feel is the epitome of the hoard. But before we go on there, looking a little bit towards the southeast, a place called St Albans in Hertfordshire. Interesting story from the 1880s. Several oak beams were removed from an old house. Eventually, a little boy who was employed at the yard thought about chopping up one of these timbers. But this is a story, it's got to be out of a book of fiction, but it's true. Split the timber with his axe, and a hoard of coins dating to the 1500s was found. The later coins dating to Henry VIII. These, it's described, fell from holes that had been bored in the wood. Maybe the timber had come from a monastery that had been taken apart at the time of the dissolution. The Fishpool hoard, found in Nottinghamshire in 1966, was also found by workmen. More than 12,000 gold coins from the reigns of Edward III to Edward IV, dated from 1327 to 1483, were found, including beautiful pieces of jewellery, as you can see. These had been excavated by a mechanical digger. They could have equally been completely missed, because mechanical diggers these days can be extremely sizable with the buckets they use. But this was found by complete accident. Moving on, we look at two treasures from the farthest reaches of Scotland. These treasures take us to a part of history that is sometimes missed. The first image shows the Traprain Law treasure. This is associated with a legend. Traprain Law is a place between Dunbar and Haddington in East Lothian. The treasure was found, which is believed to be associated with the legend of King Loth of Lothian, who used this site at Traprain Law as one of his strongholds. Archaeologists excavating there in 1919 revealed more than 160 pieces of bowls and drinking vessels. A similar story of a find like this comes from Fife, or a place called Norrie's Law, on the Largo estate of General James Durham. Legend had it that a warrior lay there, clad in silver armour. Looking into this legend, a tinker in 1819 secretly dug at the site and came away with a considerable amount of ancient silverware and sold it in Edinburgh. The tinker hastily disappeared with his profits. When news of his discovery leaked out, General Durham seized the remaining treasure. The items dating from the 600s, mainly on display at the National Museum of Antiquities in Edinburgh. As for the items sold by the tinker, I do not know. Fascinating treasures, where we're always told that X never ever marks a spot, comes from a period equally as ancient. Relics of early Christianity further north come from a site known as St. Ninians Isle. In 1958, a team of archaeologists working in a lonely, disused church of St. Ninian on Shetland found a slab with a cross carved on it. This takes us to an Indiana Jones film, Last Crusade. Underneath this cross was a wooden box containing silver items, various of religious background, bowls, communion bowls, spoons, brooches, and jawbone of a porpoise. You can see the intermingling of the Picts and Christianity in this wonderful boss on a bowl. This next treasure doesn't seem as grand, but is important in that it was found in the centre of our great land, and it's one of the largest coin hoards ever found in England. It was unearthed by workmen at Tutbury in Staffordshire in 1831. While repairs were being made to the south bank of the River Dove just below Tutbury Bridge, several coins were seen shining in the mud. A careful search revealed about 20,000 silver coins dating from the reigns of Edward I and Edward II between 1321 and 1329. How this got there, the most likely explanation is it was amongst the possessions lost by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, when his baggage train was swept away as it was crossing the Dove in 1328, similar to that story of King John when he lost his treasure in 1216 on the Wash, as we saw last week. Experts believe that the coins, probably in a military chest that had long since rotted away, were swept downstream, where they were gradually covered by mud and where they remained until their discovery 500 years later. A story that takes us to a period in time and a place and a treasure that we'll all be familiar with. The burial ship of a pagan king. The most magnificent treasure yet discovered in Britain has to be seen as the Sutton Hoo ship burial. Found in July 1939, not far from Woodbridge in Suffolk, by the estuary of the river Desburn, lay an area of heathland sprinkled with ancient burial mounds, with associated myths and mists floating above them. The owner of the land, Mrs. Edith Pretty, seen in this image, decided in the late 1930s to have them examined by archaeologists. The first three opened revealed some interesting but unspectacular relics. The importance of the find comes from the next. Work then began on the largest of the mounds, and it was soon realised that beneath it had been buried a longboat, undisturbed, unlooted, of the type used by the Saxons when they came to Britain. A team of expert diggers were rapidly assembled, and as they delved deeper into the sand, they struck a chamber in the middle of the great vessel, in which, lying as it had been placed 1300 years before, was the astonishing wealth of gold, silver, jewellery, armour, personal possessions of a Swedish king, necessary items for somebody who was going into an afterlife, fit for a king. Yes, a Swedish king. We now know that the people who were the ancestors of the Vikings were already in this land before the Vikings would wrought their havoc 150 years later. The ship itself was some 89 feet long. Only the outlines of its rotted timbers remained as stains in the sand, but the excavation team found its rusted rivets still in place, with no keel and no mast or sail. It must have been laboriously rowed across the channel by at least 38 Swedish warriors. Among the finest pieces found was this purse lid, and this wonderful buckle fit for a king. The pale gold buckle weighs nearly 15 ounces. Its intricate patterns are those that can be seen buried at sites in Sweden, hence created in Sweden. Final two treasures of these two video logs are silver and the other one is gold. One of the most valuable Iron Age finds ever uncovered in Britain, and necklaces excavated in 1948, 1950, 1972 and 1985 at Kenhill, Snettisham, Norfolk. Mainly of these talks, twisted gold electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, the large electrum talk, perhaps the most magnificent ever to be found in Britain, is on display in the British Museum. It's interesting that on a number of periods people have gone back and found more and more treasure. The next hoard itself was found without the use of one of those metal detecting machines, and all the treasures today have been found without the use of a metal detector. Is the Mildenhall hoard. Yielded rich artifacts, treasure even being found today. The Mildenhall treasure itself was found during the Second World War whilst ploughing a field at West Row, Dig for Britain campaign by a farm worker. A certain Mr. Gordon Butcher unearthed a tray of engraved silver. He and his employer, Mr. Sidney Ford, subsequently discovered 33 silver pieces, all dating from the late 300s, being declared treasure trove and being bought by the British Museum in 1946. Examination by experts has shown that the Mildenhall treasure was manufactured partly in the Mediterranean and in the northern French province of Gaul, modern-day France. Consists of trays, dishes, goblets, ladles, finger bowls and spoons, some of them with Christian markings. Much of the silverware found would be pride of place on any Roman family's table. The most magnificent piece is the great dish, 24 inches in diameter. But folks, one treasure I cannot miss out on today is the treasure of the chessmen. Chessmen that terrified a crofter. The finding of one of Scotland's most famous treasures was made possible only by unusual high tides, which eroded a sandbank on the Isle of Lewis in 1831. In the spring of that year, a crofter working in the parish of Ewing on the island noticed that some stonework had been uncovered. When he tried to drive his spade into the walls because he was collecting stonework to build with, they collapsed to reveal an underground chamber, rather like a stone safe. Looking inside the cavity, the crofter saw what he thought was a meeting of elves and gnomes. He was completely terrified because he knew that if those gnomes had looked him in the eye, he would be turned to stone. He ran and ran to the safety of his home, where his wife, perhaps more practically minded, persuaded him to risk returning to the cavern. His second visit less of an ordeal, for on closer inspection his gnomes, elves, were no more than chessmen. There were in all some 78 walrus ivory pieces of different designs. Experts later dated them as having been carved between 1135 and 1150, and the detail of their design makes them the finest early chess set yet discovered. It is believed that they were made in Scandinavia. As the pieces do not complete any one set and yet a finished work, it is likely that they are part of the original carver's workshop materials that he traded. And maybe his ship was wrecked and he quickly hid them in a crevice at this site. Most of the pieces are now in the British Museum, but 11 were bought by the National Museum of Antiquities in Edinburgh. Makes you think, when Scotland becomes independent, will they reunite all 78 pieces in one cabinet? And on that note, thank you for listening to this video log today, and hopefully you've gleaned some treasure from the treasure itself.